For the latest on the trade tensions with China and other issues, let's welcome U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. Were you originally in the group that was headed over before it was canceled, Mr.
Yes.
Secretary?
Oh, yes, for sure.
Yes, and it has been duly noted that the United States not sending one, and many of the other countries, that there is a paucity, if you will, of government officials here. So we're left to our own designs, and I can tell you there's some gloom and doom over here, Wilbur. You think it's warranted?
Well, I don't think that it's warranted in terms of the U.S. because our economy continues very, very strong. There are some problems, some economic problems developing in Europe, in China, and in Japan. You've been seeing those in the recent statistics.
Wilbur, it was, what day is it? Today's Thursday. So you saw the market sell off on the word that there were problems with the upcoming trade talks with China. One of your co-workers, if you will, in the administration, Mr. Kudlow, came on and dispelled some of those rumors. Can you give us the latest on where everything stands with the upcoming talks with China?
Well, where things stand is that there's a very large delegation of Chinese, about 30 people, coming over for a couple of days, 29th and 30th next week. So there is a very large group coming. There's been a lot of anticipatory work done, but we're miles and miles from getting a resolution, and frankly, that shouldn't be too surprising. Trade is very complicated. There are lots and lots of issues, not just how many soybeans and how much LNG, but even more importantly, structural reforms that we really think are needed in the Chinese economy. And then even more important than that, enforcement mechanisms and penalties for failure to adhere to whatever we agree to.
And complex enough to where anyone that's been paying attention knew that it would be impossible to get a completely final deal wrapped up by the time that we get the deadline. So what's the best that we could expect? I mean, I guess portions of things could be decided on, but then it's going to be, we're going to meet for a longer period of time and push out to another date, trying to get a more complete, to try and take care of all the other things you just talked about. Is that what we should expect?
Well, remember, we have until March 1st. That's when the new tariffs are supposed to go in, the increase from 10 to 25%. So there's quite a little bit of time between now and then to judge just where do we stand, is it worth going forward, or have we reached an impasse?
Secretary Ross, I'd like to ask you about the government shutdown, and I realize that you're not responsible for negotiating this on either side, but you're the only person that we have coming to us from Washington, anybody from the administration or either side of the aisle on this. So I am going to bring it up today because there was some disturbing news that came out earlier today. This is something from the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, along with the airline pilots and the flight attendants. They put out a statement that said, in our risk-averse industry, we cannot even calculate the level of risk currently at play nor predict the point at which the entire system will break. It is unprecedented. Air traffic controllers, transportation security officers, safety inspectors, air marshals, federal law enforcement officers, FBI agents, and many other critical workers have been working without pay for over a month. Staffing in our air traffic control facilities is already at a 30-year low, and controllers are only able to maintain the system's efficiency and capacity by working overtime, including 10-hour days and 6-day work weeks at many of our nation's busiest facilities. Almost 20% of the certified professional controllers are eligible to retire today. There are no options to keep these professionals at work without a paycheck when they can no longer afford to support their families. When they elect to retire, the national airspace system will be crippled. The situation is changing at a rapid pace in an air safety system that is deteriorating by the day. That's incredibly concerning to hear. Do you worry about safety at this point?
Well, I do worry about safety, and it's kind of disappointing that the air traffic controllers are calling in sick in pretty large numbers. Depending on the week.
Many of them can't afford to support their families, though.
Well, remember this, they are eventually going to be paid. The president signed that into law.
Mr. Secretary, but many of these people need, Mr. Secretary, many of these workers clearly need the paycheck on a week-by-week basis. They're not,
Sure.
frankly, in my shoes, nor in yours, nor in
Right.
yours. And
Well,
so the question is this battle and fight at this point in the ballgame worth it? Meaning, is the debate over everything else that the administration's fighting for worth more than the risk that's being taken on at this very moment, and the effect that it's having on the families of these federal workers?
Well, first of all, the banks and the credit unions should be making credit available to them. When you think about it, these are basically government guaranteed loans because the government has committed these folks will get their back pay once this whole thing gets settled down. So there really is not a good excuse why there really should be a liquidity crisis. Now, true, the people might have to pay a little bit of interest, but the idea that it's paycheck or zero is not a really valid idea. There's no reason why some institution wouldn't be willing to lend. And indeed, we've heard tales of some of the government.
So it should be put on the
unions.
private sector? The private sector needs to step up where the public sector can't?
No, what I'm saying is there have been ads run by a number of the public sector credit unions, which are member organizations of the people who work in the departments. Those have announced very, very low interest rate loans to bridge people over the gap. That's the kind of cooperation between financial community and employee that really is warranted. It's a totally safe loan because at the end of the day, it's 100% government guaranteed.
Hey, Wilbur, I don't want to make too much out of 70 or 80 points, but there's the S&P future, S&P. But if we look at the Dow futures, we were up about 40, 50 when we started. We're now in negative territory, and we at the bottom of the screen we're quoting you miles and miles to go before China, before we have any type of agreement. Did you plan to come on to temper expectations? Is that a different tone than we would have been hearing from the administration over the last few days? Is something, is it posturing, or are we trying to extract more, or is that a change, any change at all from what we would have heard last week from the president, for example?
No, I don't think so. I believe that China would like to make a deal. I believe that we would like to make a deal, but it has to be a deal that works for both parties. And all I'm trying to do is to say people shouldn't think that the events of next week are going to be the solution to all of the issues between the United States and China. It's too complicated a topic, too many issues. It's not a realistic expectation. That's different from saying that we won't get to a deal. I think there's a fair chance we do get to a deal.
Okay.
Fair chance that we get to a deal, or I guess let me ask this way too. Just the idea of tariffs doubling come March 1st or March 2nd. That's what I think would surprise a lot of people. Would you advocate not raising those tariffs, even if we don't have a completed deal, if it looks like you are on track to getting towards a deal at that point?
Well, I think it's very hard to prejudge exactly where we'll be at that point in time. But as that date approaches, the president and those of us who are helping with the trade issues will get together. We'll have a very serious discussion where we stand at that point, and there'll be an announcement made once the decision has occurred. To judge now, weeks beforehand, what may happen over the next 5 or 6 weeks, it's too hard to do that. My point is simply, people shouldn't think next week is going to be the solution to all the problems of the world. Hopefully, we can make a good start on it and follow up later on.
Wilbur, many times in the past, you've used some examples of how much of our economy is affected by some of the moves that we've made, some of our tariffs against China. We've talked about how many pennies per aluminum can or whatever. But and I know that you weren't born last night, obviously, but now we're starting to see that when China slows down, it doesn't necessarily have to be how it directly affects the U.S. economy. I mean, we're talking about global GDP, possibly, tenths of a point being cut off of that for whatever reason that China's slowing down. There's a piece in the Journal today that there's a real risk of a hard landing in China, not just because of the trade friction, but because of the shadow banking policies of the country, et cetera. But does that go into our thinking that if we really do hurt China trying to extract a deal, it can come back to us kind of indirectly from a slowdown in the global economy? Are we ready to deal with that because of our actions?
I think there are several cross currents underway in the global economy. For one thing, there are quite a lot of companies relocating production from China, some cases to the U.S., in other cases to Vietnam and other low-income areas. There had been the beginnings of a move for that even before the trade issues, because China is not the world's cheapest place to manufacture products anymore. But it's been accelerated a bit by the trade issues, because that interjects a note of uncertainty into corporate decisions. So I think you're seeing with the other countries some backing and filling, some good things coming out of the dispute with China, namely people relocating their sources to those countries, and some bad things, because a lot of what is finally assembled in China comes from other Southeast Asian countries. Something like 60% of the value added is brought into China, and it's only the remainder that's added in China. So it's a complicated situation. Europe is again another separate thing. You've got a lot of problems in a lot of countries there, and that's probably why the European Central Bank is continuing to be so permissive in terms of its interest rates.
Mr. Secretary, I wanted to come back for just a moment to the U.S. government shutdown. While here in Davos, I interviewed Alex Karp. He's the CEO of Palantir, a major government contractor in the United States, working on behalf of the Pentagon and the Defense Department. He said that the government shutdown, he believed, was terribly damaging to the brand of our country. Do you believe that?
I think that's a great deal of hyperbole. We've had shutdowns before, albeit for not such a long period as we've been thus far. But put it in perspective, you're talking about 800,000 workers, and while I feel sorry for the individuals that have hardship cases, 800,000 workers, if they never got their pay, which is not the case, they will eventually get it, but if they never got it, you're talking about 1/3% on our GDP. So it's not like it's a gigantic number overall.
Mr. Secretary, Mr. Secretary, there are reports that there are some federal workers who are going to homeless shelters to get food.
Well, I know they are, and I don't really quite understand why, because as I mentioned before, the obligations that they would undertake, say a borrowing from a bank or a credit union, are in effect federally guaranteed. So the 30 days of pay that some people will be out, there's no real reason why they shouldn't be able to get a loan against it. And we've seen a number of ads from financial institutions doing that.
Wilbur, before we go, just back to China, just real quickly. So there was some talk about a trade deficit deal where we'd be at zero by 2024 or something. Is that, what are we looking for? Are we looking for that? Are we looking for solving intellectual property? Are we looking for the way that our companies or foreign companies do business in China? What's going to take miles and miles and years? What's the real sticking point if there was some talk about having a trade deficit go to zero? In 6 years, what do we want? What's the sticking point right now, in your view, that's going to take so long?
Well, there are really two prongs. One is the so-called old economy, more or less the economies of the world as they are today. We do have an intolerably big trade deficit with China in them. So that's one prong. The other prong is the future. That's the 2025 plan that they have to try to dominate world high-tech industries. We have to protect that. And then the third area is American companies doing business in China should have market access, should have a level playing field, should not be subject to disrespect for their intellectual property rights, all of that. So we need both structural reforms for the longer term, and we need forbearance on the present trade deficit. And of those series of things, the easiest part for the Chinese to solve is the trade part. Because if they buy LNG from us or they buy it from someone else, there's really no economic cost to them. Same thing with soybeans, same thing with a lot of products. The hard things are structural reforms and, most importantly, making sure that they really live up to their agreements, because the history has not been a good one in terms of living up to commitments.
All right, Mr. Secretary, thank you for all your time this morning. We appreciate it.